Welcome, everybody, to today's session of the Inclusive Data Hackathon, a fireside chat on unmasking AI, the ethics, collaboration, and unconscious bias that goes into this exciting topic that seems to be taking place everywhere. We have two amazing industry leaders joining us today. But before we get into that, I'm actually going to share a short video that really gives insight as to why this is such an important topic for us to be discussing. So bear with us for just a moment.
I'm not Morgan Freeman, and what you see is not real. Well, at least in contemporary terms, it is not. What if I were to tell you that I am not even a human being? Would you believe me? What is your perception of reality? Is it the ability to capture, process, and make sense of the information our senses receive? If you can see, hear, taste, or smell something, does that make it real? Or is it simply the ability to feel? I would like to welcome you to the era of synthetic reality. Now, what do you see?
I'm very curious to hear what everybody sees. Synthetic reality, generative AI, hot topic, as we've mentioned, is one of the core challenges that we've got for this Inclusive Data Hackathon. And all of our explorers have the opportunity to choose one of 5 generative AI related topics. But as promised, we have 2 industry leaders, really exciting conversation to speak to you about. It really ingrains every aspect of our life today. So with that, our 2 industry leaders today are Darren Oberst, the CEO of AI Bloks. And Darren has over 20 years of experience. He started off his career as an investment banker, but has a passion for machine learning, natural language processing, and AI. And he's been able to combine those skills over the last 10 years to form his company, AI Bloks. And joining him is Alok Benjwal, the head of the domain solutions capabilities for Capgemini Financial Services, banking and capital markets. And Alok comes to the table as well with 20 plus years of experience heading various data and analytics organizations for multiple financial services companies, including banking as well as insurance. So with that, I invite our speakers to the floor. Alok, all yours.
Thank you, Amita. Hi, Darren. Welcome to the chat here. I think it is only apt given we are officially in June and it is still cold like winter. So we are having a fireside chat. So Darren, I know that this world of AI has really not been new to the industry. The models have been used in credit decisioning, fraud management, and multiple spaces. But we're talking about 500 billion parameters and even like 1 trillion parameters in GPT-4.
Yep.
Where do you think all this is heading towards?
Well, Alok, thank you. It's a great opportunity to be here. I don't have a fire going, but actually is a little warm here today in Connecticut. But hopefully we can heat some things up through the conversation. I think your comment is a great way to frame the discussion. Many of these issues have been going on for a long time. What's new? First, it's certainly public awareness and some of the success of models like ChatGPT that I think have really sparked public imagination about what this technology is capable of. And at times, given people even a false sense of the maturity of the technology and its capabilities. The other thing that you mentioned that I think is equally important is the models keep getting bigger and bigger. And a model that has 100 billion plus parameters, no one knows what's inside that model. The large language models today, given the size of the model, as well as the size and breadth of the information that's used to train the model, it's simply so large that it's very, very hard for anyone to really understand what are the dynamics of what's going on in terms of all of these parameters inside the model, how it yields an output, and how to ultimately correlate that output with what the input is or what the input should be. So I think we are at a pretty interesting inflection point, both due to this fact of the market phenomena and the excitement around the technology, as well as I think the size and complexity of the models themselves really going up a different order of magnitude in the last few years.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting you raised that point about input and output. Specifically on the input, I mean, the biases in the data itself,
Yeah.
if there are historical biases in the way certain decisions have been made and that data is fed into those models, it's very obvious that those biases will come out in the math as well.
Yeah.
How does a modeler account for those inherent biases in the input data itself? How do you neutralize that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first place it starts is just with recognition that it is a problem. And anybody that reads AI research papers, certainly over the course of the last 2 to 3 years, there is growing recognition from the people who are developing the technology. And usually those types of issues are acknowledged extensively throughout the research paper. Efforts are made to try to understand where some of those biases might lie. And I think that is the first part is recognition that these models are capable of both explicit bias and implicit bias. And so the more transparency and awareness you have of the issues, the better the understanding and the clarity you have around the input data set. And then the more testing you have to really try to validate that what you've put into the model is consistent with what you're getting out of the model. I think those are definitely steps in the right direction. But it's an extremely complicated problem. We as society have been dealing with these issues and grappling with them. How do we address implicit bias in all of our organizations? Now thinking about it through a slightly different lens of in technologies that are going to be used for decisioning or that are going to be generating, as Morgan Freeman said, synthetic reality. How do we make sure that that synthetic reality reflects, again, the kind of environment that we ultimately want it to?
Yeah, great point. And then if you come to the output, I think it's important to have that human intervention and that
Absolutely.
constant audit framework, just to make sure that you do not leave that decisioning purely on AI or the outputs that the AI models create. I think that human intervention has to be there. So,
Yeah.
what are some of the steps or uh, some of the things that you need to take care of when it comes to audit and reviewing of those outputs?
Yeah, it's a great point. And it's one of those things that for many, many years in kind of the AI community, any vendor bringing forward an AI solution usually has some form of human in the loop. We've also always heard vendors that will say, we believe that AI should live side by side, with people. Again, it's kind of a funny way to articulate it, but basic idea is there should be some human review or oversight of any kind of output that comes from a model. And I think that's just a sensible, best practice. Where it gets, I think, more complicated is with the proliferation of generative AI. The output from the AI itself can be so compelling and so convincing and look so human in its quality that it's very easy for someone to, in good faith, believe that it did go through some type of review. There's a story I saw earlier this week, and who knows how true it is, but in fact, it could have been a deep synthetic fake. But it was an attorney who had used ChatGPT for some legal research. The person was not a technical expert, but they thought if they asked a question to ChatGPT, that the answer that came back would be factual, would be true. And the person had apparently cut and paste some references and case citations that they had received from ChatGPT. The opposing legal counsel ultimately discovered that those cases that had been cited were completely synthetic. They were not real cases. They were not real holdings. Even the numbers that were used were not real case numbers. And what the attorney said, he wasn't trying to pull a fast one. The lawyer thought, well, I asked this technology, it's leading edge technology. I assumed when I got back an answer that looked so clear and accurate, I assumed that it was factual and that I could rely upon it. So
Yeah.
I think we're going to hear more and more stories like that, where truly in good faith, someone has an expectation that the technology can do this, when in reality, it can only do this. So
Yeah, I read about that one, and I think they sued an airlines in that case. I think on the flip side, I was reading another one where there is a Dutch bank which is like completely a digital bank. It's called Bunq, and the central bank of Netherlands, they actually fined them for using AI in their fin crime and AML strategy, and the bank actually fought the case, and the court ruled in favor of the bank, saying that the traditional rule-based AML investigation uh, is actually performing less than the AI-backed algorithms that that bank was using, and the ruling was in favor of the bank actually. So I think coming to regulations, I think we also need to talk about creating some kind of ethical frameworks within the banks and within financial services companies in how they use AI responsibly. There has to be some controls in place. At the same time, I think we will also see some of these regulators coming out with some kind of acts and regulations. What do you think about that?
yeah, it's a great point. People aren't perfect. When you look at any type of scale, operational process, if it's 95 to 99%, accurate, that's pretty good. So there will be exceptions, variances, mistakes that people will make as well. I think one of the challenges that that AI has is first making sure that it's sensibly applied. So if it's an input into any of these types of decisions, and if the technology is well suited for that, that's very different than a case where a technology is being applied really in a use case or a scenario that it's not very well suited for. And then second, ultimately, is there some people-based review, some process that sits on top of that to really validate it before ultimately a final decision is taken? I think when those conditions are in place, technology is a great tool. It's a great enabler for business. And this isn't the first time, and I'm sure you've seen this at many times with many of your clients. It's not the first time that a new technology has emerged that requires, safeguards, that requires some understanding and learning about how to best apply it. And so I think, right now we're still, going through that life cycle of figuring out how to really integrate these technologies in safe ways into business processes.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think the key is to really use AI as an assistant and not really let it be the primary.
Yep.
And I think if you really use it as an assistant or a utility, I think you can really power some of the use cases. I think in banking, at least what we are seeing is it is being used in customer service, AML and fin crime is another one. Even your KYC and customer due diligence. We are also seeing some of the intermediary being augmented with the intelligence. So if you have these financial advisors and brokers and any human that kind of interfaces with the customer, they can get intelligent insights in doing their job. Another big one, obviously, there is a lot of buzz, and I'm not so close to it, but would be very happy to get your views on is
Mhm.
the whole code conversion and code migration. And they are saying that it can cut almost like 40% of work that humans used to do in developing software. What do you think about that?
It's an interesting question. Anybody that's on the call who's a programmer knows everyone uses Google, Stack Overflow. Everyone does some cut and paste of code snippet or a little recipe, something to get started that you see online. So I think there's sort of a logical next step of, well, what if you could apply some type of smarter algorithm that could somehow understand the problem that you were trying to solve and even then generate the answer to it. There are many people that are having good responses and feedback doing that. Personally, I have some concerns. I don't know that it's ultimately going to be the most effective use of the technology. It can often provide, code that compiles or that's syntactically accurate. But I think there's a lot of questions about, is that code that you would ultimately want to roll out? And would the end-to-end life cycle truly be compressed from, getting some code, as you said, using it as an assistant, doing some, further moderation of it or oversight of it, fixing it, or is it faster to just start with what's in your head and start to get that as the starting point? I don't know. The other area, I think, from an ethical point of view, that I think we're at a very early stage of, is all those code models have been trained off other people's code without their permission. So, what if, code that you get is derived from code that in one way, shape, or form was either copyrighted or was a trade secret, or maybe was even just in good faith, something that somebody viewed as private. So I think sorting through all the thicket of issues around this code generation, potential copyright issues, quality issues associated with it, I think we're still at a pretty early stage of working through a lot of those issues. What do you see? Have you had some experience? Obviously, in your role,
Yeah,
you develop a lot of code. I'm sure you do a lot of testing and quality type work. What's been the experience that you've had?
yeah, we are actually seeing some success in, and obviously it's not rolled out into production, more on the testing stage right now. But at least replication of code or being able to generate code uh, is something we are seeing initial success. I think even in the code migration, where you are
Mm-hmm.
trying to migrate from one legacy language to a new set of languages like Python, or if you're trying to migrate ETL
Mm-hmm.
code, we are seeing some initial success actually,
Mm. That's
and
great.
it's fairly accurate. But I agree with some of the compliance or uh, you know
Mm.
copyright kind of issues that can,
Yeah.
and that you were kind of highlighting.
It strikes me, what's really interesting to me about what you said is, I think it's finding the right use case. And I do think that's one of the meta themes, of this discussion. If you apply the technology in the right types of use cases, it can deliver tremendous value, and it can do it in safe ways. I think the biggest areas where AI and uses of AI get into these sort of difficult, ethical issues is when people are basically applying the technology into domains that maybe don't have some of those built-in checks and balances, or where the technology is not very well suited for.
Yeah, I think, yeah, exactly. And I think there is this whole notion of how you use AI, where you are kind of trying to do the right thing,
Mm-hmm.
but go wrong because
Yeah.
of that explainability factor, because there are so many parameters now, and you cannot really, and then there are neural network kind of things, where the models go like in multiple layers,
Yeah.
which is still like somebody trying to use AI responsibly. But then there is the other thing that worries me about, which is really the bad actors using AI and deliberately trying to do wrong things. And AI being so powerful, I think that is a part that scares me a lot, because we were seeing this video, and
Mm.
that could really be used by a bad actor to
Yeah.
kind of have social impact, a negative social impact. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. And it can be done in a lot of very smart, subtle ways. Um, if it's Morgan Freeman, and he's saying, this is not real, okay. But what if it's a deep fake of, a non-public figure, of somebody that you work with? And the message has all types of distinctive characteristics that are unique to that person. It's much harder to tell that's something that isn't real. Within models themselves, they can be vehicles for spreading misinformation quite naturally. Um, to the point you've made a couple of times that I completely agree with about the size of these models. Most of the large language models have been trained with hundreds of billion to low trillions of individual tokens. When you have a data set that's that large, no one can know definitively what's in it. There are all sorts of filters that OpenAI and Google and large research organizations have built to try to find problematic material. There's other steps to sort of curate, to remove, but when you're talking about a data set that large, it's virtually impossible to definitively say there isn't misinformation or bad content or malicious content that's part of it. And I'll give a quick story because it was illustrative for me. It was about a month ago. I was training a model, a big model. Not 100 billion parameters, but it's a 7 billion plus parameter model that likewise had been trained on billions and billions of tokens. I was training it for a very specific purpose, and I started to see after one of the training runs some just strange behavior from the model. It came across a document that had the word Massachusetts in it. And in about a third of the cases, it was replacing the MA with an MU. And I said, what could this be? Like, how could it be that all of a sudden it keeps spelling Massachusetts, MU? And I went back and I looked at all the training data that I had used. And in one sample, I had actually mistyped. I'd put MU. One sample in a model that large with that much pre-training, and in one sample, it started impacting the behavior of the model. Now, to your point, that was an accident, but imagine a bad actor taking a base model, doing some incremental fine-tuning, and injecting misinformation into that model. And it doesn't have to be, complete outright fabrications. But imagine if just a few pieces of misinformation are sprinkled into that model, it becomes very, very difficult for a person to, piece that out and to realize that the model has in some way been corrupted.
Yeah, I think that is scary. And there is a non-profit, maybe you've heard about it, Future of Life.
Hmm.
They had recently written an open letter, I think back in March,
Hmm.
which was signed by like big figures like Elon Musk and
Hmm.
Chris Wozniak and uh, other CEOs,
Hmm.
which basically is appealing to the industry
Hmm.
not to go beyond GPT-4, which is using 1 trillion uh, parameters, not to develop AI models which will go beyond that number of parameters. So, and going back to your example that you were giving, and that problem of how do you explain and identify that factual uh, error. One way is obviously to develop controls and have some ethical framework within each company which is kind of using AI, so that they do it in a responsible way, and you have controls in place so that those mistakes do not happen. But could AI be the answer itself in like detecting uh, certain kind of biases or certain kind of errors that could come through the output of these models? Can you just use AI to kind of detect those things as well?
I think you probably could, and I'm sure there are people developing things like that. Certainly, when you look at what OpenAI or Google, they do have auxiliary filters that are smaller AI models that have been special purpose trained to identify and root out toxic content, other things in terms of low quality of the output. So I think there are a variety, call them, of smaller AI filters that will be applied to all of these models. I remember after ChatGPT kind of hit the news, there were a few people that developed like, I'm going to help you figure out if some content is from ChatGPT. There have been several initiatives where people are trying to bootstrap, actually take output from an OpenAI model or a Google model, take those, and then train other models. Some using kind of a teacher-student kind of architecture. In other cases, trying to, in effect, bootstrap to create that content to go train other models. So I think we're going to see a lot of activity around this whole thing of how do you use AI to train other AI? How do you use AI to supervise other AI? I think there's also a really promising path of how do you start using algorithms that are grounded in very different kinds of architectures or principles to cross-reference or cross-check each other. So you feed the same type of input into two models that are constructed very differently and have a very different type of architecture. It becomes a validation then of you're probably on the right path. So I think that also is a direction that we'll see as well.
Yep. I think there is a question coming from the audience. What are your thoughts on the possibilities of AI being connected to the internet? I think it already is, right? Isn't it? What are your views on that, Darren?
So it's a great question. And in some ways, it's like $1 trillion question if you think about it, right? Because that's what Google and Microsoft are trying to solve for. In effect, how do you create this unified experience, bringing together kind of all the benefits of information retrieval from the web, combined then with this kind of generative AI that can start synthesizing and creating outputs based on it. So it's a fantastic question. Again, it's something that a lot of money and a lot of smart people are going to be working on. I think that there are a few different ways that people are trying to embed the internet into the models themselves. And so that's maybe a narrower part of your question. So there have been many efforts, Google and OpenAI, Microsoft, where in the material they use to train the model, in effect, they're embedding URLs. They're embedding special signals. Google had a model that the idea was the model, as part of generating its output, would identify, aha, here's a factual point, or here's a point that I now want to go call out to some sort of knowledge source and bring that knowledge back to me. And whatever answer I generate should come from that, auxiliary knowledge tool. So I think that's one mode of this is the model itself becoming aware and being able to access and draw on material from the web. The other modality is maybe the opposite, which you already see in some of Google's search, in Bing. For many, many years, both of them have exploited machine learning and question answering and semantic embedding and knowledge graphs, deploying a range of AI technologies as part of giving more effective search results, information retrieval, and packaging of results to users. So I think it's going to be a very fertile area, and we're probably going to see it coming from both of these directions.
Yeah, and I think, again, that you have to kind of also be careful in how you utilize those summarizations, because going back to our inputs and the example that you were giving about that attorney using blindly using that summary and inserting it in the filing of that case filing. So because internet is filled with good information and bad information, and I think blindly using it can lead to wrong decisions.
Yeah.
In fact, there is another thing that we are seeing is really training the models on only good data and only particular domains.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
if you want to really use, let's say, Chat GPT for knowledge management within a certain domain, within an industry, then just make it learn data on that domain itself, so that it's not hallucinating on whatever is widely available on the internet.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic point. It's something we believe in very strongly, that the future may not be a handful of big models. Um, to manage 175 billion parameter model is extraordinarily complex. If you can build more special purpose, domain specific, functional specific models, anywhere from maybe 3 billion parameters to 20 billion parameters, the infrastructure complexity comes down dramatically. And it's perhaps a different vision of how AI unfolds over time, that an enterprise doesn't have, one AI model, it's one Uber brain that it taps into. Instead, it may have dozens or even hundreds of very specific tools that are custom built for specific purposes.
Yep, completely agree. There is another question from the audience. I think, to what extent can a data scientist or AI developer influence the ethical considerations of an AI solution being built? Take that one, Darren.
Sure. I think it's a fantastic question, and I'll start by saying I think one of the best things that technical people in AI can do is helping to explain to the rest of that project team not just the strengths of the technology, but also the limitations, the constraints, and the gaps of it. Because I do think one of the areas where AI projects get in trouble is in effect when it's misscoped, when the expectation is just like that lawyer. Oh well, it's of course going to be able to read cases for me and supply the right things like a legal associate would. So I think that's a first place to start, and it can be challenging because sometimes the business requirements that can come in can be very daunting. Sometimes business people expect the world, and sometimes their expectations of what the technology can do aren't realistic. So that would be the first place that I would start, is help be an evangelist for the real capabilities and the real limitations of the technology. I think the second thing then is in really thinking about the models that you're designing. Think through the issues of data transparency and integrity, and take those issues seriously. And that's both issues of true social bias, but it's also issues of, if you don't have enough diversity of the types of statistical patterns that you're looking to embody in the model, you don't have that diversity, you can create a model that works very well on the surface with 2 or 3 really perfectly chosen examples, but the underlying capabilities of the model then haven't really been developed for the intended use case. So that would be my second comment, is I think it's all
Yeah.
really about understanding the data and making sure that you're feeding the right kind of data to support the ultimate use case of the model.
Yeah, great points. I think, and one I would add is not leaving it after the model is done. I think that whole human
Yeah,
intervention and making sure that
absolutely.
your model review process is always living and breathing,
Yeah,
so that your outputs are correct, as well as the model stays relevant over a period of time. I think it
absolutely.
really needs that nurturing and care from the data science community.
Absolutely. It's a great point.
I think one topic that I wanted to touch upon is really this buzz around collaborative AI development. Uh, and they're saying there will be a lot of interaction between outputs of AI generated uh, content, as well as something that a normal data scientist or a software developer does. What are your views on that?
I think it's extremely important. I also think it's one of the sources of complexity, and one of the big risk factors. Um, I'm sure you've worked with a lot of banks over the years that have started off an AI project with the best of intentions, and maybe millions of dollars later, not seen the results that they were hoping for. It's a good project in AI requires a lot of different skills, a lot of communication, a lot of collaboration, and at a lot of levels. So you can start at a governance level with all the right principles, all the right things, oversight from the right types of business stakeholders and people looking at it through the right angle. But a lot of times it comes down to that devil in the details. So the example I used of the Massachusetts with the MU, tiny detail, but critical to the end outcome. So if all the way down in kind of the deep execution level of the project, if you don't have the right attention to detail, to the types of data that are being fed in, the diversity of that data, the ethical nature of that, a lot can break down. A lot. One thing, Alok, it's interesting. As we've been building some of our own models over the last 6 months, we've really dug in to a lot of common, well-regarded, industry data sets that are open source and out in the community and that are used by everyone. When you really start going through them one by one and start looking at the samples, you realize there's a lot of content that's in there that probably has not gone through review, by people who are at that level of thinking about the wider implications of it. So I think it's a great point. I think it's a great opportunity for all the service providers in this industry is how do you assemble that type of skill? How do you enable that type of collaboration at all the levels that are required?
Yeah, great points. One question I had for you, Darren, I wanted to know your views is there a way to, are there techniques or ways to unbias the inherent biases in the data? Like you, if there is a racial bias, for example, uh, can you like reduce the weightage of those biases? And are there ways to adjust and debias the data by doing that?
So it's a complicated question. Generally speaking, and I'm going to answer technically before maybe at a more strategic level, but from a technical point of view, the answer is yes. You think about today all these models that are used. Very few people are starting with a blank architecture and randomly initialized weights. And even 5 years ago, that would have been the status quo. Today, almost anyone is going to be picking up some model that already has some base level of training. Our experience is with a few hundred targeted samples, training samples of incremental training, you can influence the behavior of even these models that have had billions of tokens that they've been trained on. Few hundred samples, you can dramatically change the behavior of that model. So technically, is it possible in effect to find an eraser or find a debiaser that could be applied onto one of these models that would significantly change its behavior on this? I think the answer technically is absolutely yes. Now, maybe the harder question is the strategic, the ethical, the cultural. What does that data set look like? How do you create it? How do you know when you've achieved success? And there are, Google has done a lot of good work in this area, as have others, in trying to put forward what they believe are kind of ethical data sets or data sets that, again, will reduce implicit bias. But again, I think that touches into so many broader issues of society and industry and other things.
Yep. I think there is a question from the audience. Are there any successful examples of cross-industry collaboration that led to inclusive and ethical AI solutions? I think we are starting afresh a little bit when it comes to ethical considerations. There has always been the MRM organizations within financial services, which go through a very deep model review process. I think this area is a little bit nascent because the models that were actually being used for decision making so far have been very explainable, and they use a very limited number of parameters. I think with the explosion of this whole era of large language models and these billions of parameters, I think already there is a cross-industry initiative where people are trying to adhere to standard ethical AI guidelines. Even the governments are doing a lot of work in this space. I think there is a legislation in the European Parliament, at least I'm aware of, that is going to come later this year, and I know the U.S. government is also doing something along those lines. Would you like to add anything to that, Darren?
Yeah, no, I think your answer is spot on. I would add maybe a slightly broader point, which we haven't hit yet, which is there have been a lot of commentary from very prominent people saying we should slow down AI development. We've seen certainly many governments, especially in Europe, starting to initiate some form of regulation. I think these are very profound challenges. They should be taken very seriously. But I think it would be, I think it's an overreaction to say that development of technology should slow down. If you look at history, that's rarely the right answer. And I think in most cases, more research along the lines of how to address these issues is going to be part of the solution, not part of the problem intrinsically. I think in terms of government regulation, I think it's going to be interesting to see how governments handle actually copyright issues. Because if you really look at the origin of all these models, there's in effect a huge appropriation of content, typically over the web, where it was already some expectation that it was public information. But at the time that you put up your website, did you realize that content was going to be scraped and integrated into a model and repackaged and reused in so many different ways that you couldn't imagine? Most large language models have copy rates where they're literally copying things, 10% to 40%. So a lot of what is being generated is in one form or another substantially, similar to copyrighted material. So I think there's definitely going to be a need for regulation, around that. I think there will also likely be some need for regulation around transparency and communication of what the technology can do and can't do. It's not OpenAI's fault that lawyer thought that accurate case law was coming out. It's not their fault. In fact, it seems in all their communications, they're very, very upfront of saying what the model can do and can't do. But it is a societal problem that all of our imaginations run wild when we hear words like AI, or when we experiment with something like ChatGPT. So more education, transparency, communication about what the models can do and can't do. I think all of those are going to be areas that I'm sure governments all over the world are going to be looking at.
Yep. So I think great point, and I think we are at the top of the hour.
We are at the top of hour, but before we do close out, I'd like to just kind of take it back to you and say, are there any final closing thoughts you each have that you'd like to leave our viewers with?
Yeah, so I think it is really about, in my mind, about transparency and fairness, and being able to create that framework where you enable that transparency and fairness in the model development process, and even how the models are maintained over a period of time, and how the output of these models is used. I think there will be a combination of the industry coming forward and setting up some standards, as well as the government coming and setting up some regulations to build these guardrails and controls in place. Darren?
I would just add, I think we've covered so many of the risk elements of this. I would close, I think, with just a very optimistic statement, about where these technologies are and where they're evolving to. I think if we were having this conversation even 12 months ago or 24 months ago, it would have been a very different discussion. The audience tuning in probably would be very different, and the reality of these issues for all of our clients was also very different. So I think we're at this really interesting, moment when the technology is established, it's powerful and it's real, and our clients don't want to be left behind. But at the same time, there are all these really profound issues that we're all still trying to grapple with and figure out, as these technologies are getting rolled out. So I think for everybody on, this call, I appreciate you taking the time for this discussion. And I would just say, I think it's a great, great, exciting time to be in AI.
Thank you, Darren. I agree. I know I've personally walked away with some really interesting takeaways, including piecing parts of what you've said across the last 45 minutes is the importance of the continued human interaction and engagement with any AI model that's built, because the onus and responsibility really does lie with each and every one of us at the individual level, organizational, corporate, or a client. So with that, thank you so much. I know this was great information for all of our viewers and our hackathon participants, and we appreciate you taking the time out of your weekend to have this conversation with us. So thank you again. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.